This is what I've experienced when I was 25. I went to Gavin's house with Alexa, my best friend back then, and her boyfriend. Gavin was a guy I just got acquainted with. After we drank and hung out together, Alexa and her boyfriend went into a separate room for their own romance. Then my partner Gavin stared at me and said, "Shall we start our love too?" However, I refused to because I wasn't ready to develop a deep relationship with him yet. Then he suddenly said, "Then let's play hide and seek." I was a bit perplexed at the moment, but I decided to accept it in order to break the awkwardness. I went into my room, then I heard his voice from afar. "The time limit is 20 minutes. If I find you within that time, you'll become mine." I crawled under the bed, giggling. After a while, I started to hear something breaking outside. I started having doubts that he was up to something, but decided to just wait. Then I heard his voice from the hallway. "You have to hide well, otherwise it's not fun." Then I heard something being smashed, and the sound got closer and closer. It was just a game, but somehow I started to feel more and more anxious. The moment I was thinking about leaving, suddenly a hammer penetrated the door. I almost screamed in surprise, but I kept my mouth shut with my hands. Then he opened the door and entered the room. He was breathing heavily and was carrying a huge hammer. I started to shiver. Is he playing a joke? All kinds of thoughts disturbed my mind. Then, after a while, he slammed the closet with a hammer with all his might. There was a loud roar, and the closet door slammed open. Then he said, "Ah, she's not here? Too bad. If she was hit, I would have been a good shot." I realized what's happening when I saw him swinging the hammer. It wasn't a joke. He was insane. He picked up the hammer again and walked slowly around the room. I sat under the bed watching him move with bated breath. After a while, he stood in front of the bed. I almost stopped breathing. He suddenly took a deep breath and spoke softly. "I can hear your heartbeat from here." Then he removed the mattress from the bed, threw it away, and slammed the frame of the bed with his hammer. The wood crumbled and the hammer pierced right next to my head. He shouted, staring at me through the gap in the frame. "I missed the mark!" I crawled out, screamed, and ran frantically out of the room. He held back his hammer and followed me. I ran frantically down the hallway and slid down the stairs. He was following closely behind me. Then suddenly, the alarm rang. He stood still abruptly, looking at his watch, and said, "Time is up." He stood there blankly and said, "Let's play one more game, huh? There are so many places to hide in my house." My whole body was shaking, and I said, "I'm sorry, and that I have to go home." And he kept holding on to me, saying, "It's a shame." I left his house, got into my car, started it, and I heard his voice behind me. "Just one more game, please. I really want to have you." I immediately left the place and called the police. The police arrived at his house and discovered something shocking. At his house, Alexa and her boyfriend were found dead, their bodies squashed flat together. It turned out that Gavin had hammered them down over and over again. But Gavin was not seen in the house, and when the police searched throughout the house, he was hiding inside a closet, then burst out and swung his hammer at the officer. One policeman was seriously injured, and Gavin was shot by the police and died on the spot. My name is Sam, and this is a true story. In fact, it's a cautionary tale, so please pay attention. This story takes place when I was in 5th or 6th grade. I'm 23 now. One night when we were heading home, my dad decided to stop at the pharmacy to buy some things. I decided to stay in the car that was parked right in front of the pharmacy, and even though my dad insisted that I go with him, I stubbornly refused. Of course, he didn't like the idea of leaving me alone in the car, but he decided to just head in without me. The pharmacy was located on a busy street, and a lot of people and cars were passing. I remember there being a narrow, dark alley on the left side of the pharmacy that looked very creepy, that likely led to the backside of the street, but I didn't pay much attention to that alley at first. I was only in the car for a few minutes when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a guy coming out of the alley. He was a bit tanned. He was wearing a dirty white shirt and jeans and looked as if he was in his late 20s or early 30s. I remember being creeped out by him, especially since he came out of the alley looking around kind of frantically. He looked suspicious. That's when we made eye contact, and he started slowly walking straight to me. The thing about his walk is that it wasn't normal. He had a bent back, and his hands were in his pockets. As he walked, he would look at the pharmacy and back to the car, over and over again. The whole time, his eyes would come back to mine. He was staring at me. I quickly looked away, trying to keep his figure in my peripheral vision. Once he got to the car, he tried to open the door, but thankfully it was locked. I was so scared the whole time, but I didn't want to make things worse, so I just pretended like nothing was happening. He kept trying to open the door. I didn't actually have a phone at the time, so I reached into my pocket and then turned my body away from him, making a motion like I had just pulled a phone out of my pocket and put it to my ear. I was convinced he was trying to kidnap me. I glanced over my shoulder to see how he was acting as he continued to try to get in the car. He had a concerned look on his face, but kept looking back at the pharmacy. After what felt like forever, he gave up and walked back to the dark alley. His walk was so creepy as he went. After he was no longer in view, I quickly got out of the car and went into the pharmacy to look for my dad. Once I found him, I told him everything. He was so shocked and angry. He even insisted on searching for the guy, but I didn't tell him that the creepy guy came out of the dark alley. I didn't want something to happen to my dad. To this day, I haven't forgotten his creepy stare and walk. God knows what he wanted to do to me. What if my dad didn't lock the doors? And what if this guy hadn't given up? I'm still paranoid to this day and would never stay in the car waiting for someone. I'm so thankful to God for protecting me and for my dad's concern that led him to lock the door. Please, never, ever stay alone in a car, especially at night. And, if you must, lock the door.
I'm a man who works in the sewers. That day was also in the middle of repairs in the sewer. Then suddenly, I heard something coming out of the water quickly. So I turned my head and found something crawling towards me in the dark. At first, I thought a colleague was messing with me, but its movement was so bizarre. Its shape, slowly revealed in the dark, was a figure with numerous legs attached to the human body and was crawling creepily on the water. I ran away screaming up the ladder, and he was staring at me from below. I called the police as soon as I went up, and they went down there and searched, but they didn't find the mysterious creature. Rumor has it that there used to be a mad doctor in my town. He was a man who was crazy about bug research, and at some point he started crawling on the floor like a bug, and he's just missing. I'd thought maybe he was the one I saw in the sewers, but I also knew that no one would believe me if I told this story. I just couldn't resist the curiosity. Eventually, I went back down the sewers. Walking for a long time in the flash, I heard a faint sound somewhere. I had a hunch. I immediately pulled out the electric shocker I had brought, and at last in the dark he showed himself. He crawled towards me with his centipede-like legs. He crawled over and grabbed my leg and dragged me away at a tremendous speed. I was dragged frantically by him and used an electric shocker on him, and he collapsed screaming. His face was even more hideous when seen up close. It was definitely a human face, but it was full of green skin and black veins. I'd asked him who he was, but he kept struggling to drag me away without an answer. I knocked him completely out with the electric shocker and called the police. Police arrested him and confirmed that he was surprisingly the missing doctor. And shockingly, it was confirmed that several legs that were attached to his body were attached by removing other people's legs. However, he continued to feel uneasy and did not eat anything. And he did not say anything, no matter how much the police asked. So eventually, the police put him back in the sewer and he crawled to his hiding place. When police followed him to the shelter, many skeletons were found, all of which were legless. It is also said that all kinds of surgical tools were placed. Eventually, police arrested him again, but he continued to refuse food and died shortly afterwards. It turns out he died from contracting germs from the legs of a rotten corpse. And what happened to him? It is still remembered as a creepy incident, leaving many questions.
Do you remember visiting Santa around the holidays? Do you remember sitting on his lap and telling him what you wanted for Christmas? Growing up in the 90s, I remember always getting to see Santa at the mall or at the Santa's Village in San Bernardino. I had made the trip to see Santa every year until I turned 12. At that age, I was feeling like I was getting too old to see Santa, and I didn't want to do it anymore. Out of all the Santas I visited throughout the years, there was one Santa that I could never forget, and thinking about it today still disturbs me. I was 4, and I didn't know how much danger I may have been in. This happened in the early 90s. I was traveling in the family station wagon with my mom and my 3 older siblings. We arrived at this big area that had a few big buildings, and there were a lot of people outside. I believe we were going to a homeschooling event for my older siblings. I remember being placed in a group with other kids around my age. My mom and older siblings went off to do other things and left us in the care of some lady. We formed a single line behind this lady, and I remember being near the end of the line. The lady then led us into one of the buildings. Inside, it looked like a school with a hallway and rooms with many doors. As we walked down the hallway, I noticed a room that was pitch black. I don't remember there being a door either. That should have been my first clue, that something was wrong. I heard a noise coming from the room. Sounded like a voice that said,
"Psst, hey."
At that age, I was curious, and as we established, I didn't know better. I stopped at the doorway and looked back down the hall. I watched the kids disappear into another room. At that point, I should have run to catch up with my group, but I didn't. I continued to enter the dark room until I heard the voice again. I can't remember what the voice said when I entered, but I started getting scared, thinking it was a monster. The voice then said,
"It's okay. Don't be scared. Don't be afraid of me."
The lights then came on, and sitting right there in the middle of the room on a chair was Santa Claus. "Santa!" I squealed with delight. My sense of danger was completely gone. I went over to him and was happy to see him. I got on his lap and started talking to him. He asked me the usual questions, like with all the other Santas I met. What did I want for Christmas? Was I a good girl that year? What was my name? And how old was I? Of course, I told him. Then I just started talking to him about my life, my parents, my siblings, my house, that sort of thing. It was just me and Santa talking to each other. I'm not sure how long I was with Santa, but it was probably about 10 minutes or so. To me, it felt like hours. Eventually, I felt like I had been there long enough, and I tried to leave. What happened next was more than unexpected, even to a 4-year-old talking to Santa. "I gotta go," I said to Santa. I remember trying to get off his lap, but for some reason, he wouldn't let me go. I can't remember the exact words he said to me, but it was something like, "No, I don't want you to go. You can't leave." I tried to get off his lap again, but I felt him holding on to me a little tighter, so I couldn't get off. He was restraining me. I was getting uncomfortable, and I thought Santa was acting weird. That was when I started to panic. I really wanted to get back to my group, to my family, and away from this situation. I struggled like that for what felt like forever, but was probably more like 30 seconds, before Santa finally let me go. I'm not sure what went through his mind, but he probably got scared that I would start to cry or scream, which would draw attention to the room, and he released me. I slid off his lap and darted towards the entryway. I stopped and looked back at Santa, and he was begging me to come back to him in a childlike voice. He was also pretending to cry. My final words to him were, "I gotta go. Bye, Santa." He continued pretending to cry as I left the room. I went back into the hallway and searched for the room my group was in. I didn't waste any time getting back to my group. When I found the room my group was in and entered, I saw the other kids just sitting at the tables coloring and chatting away. I found an empty spot, grabbed the paper and crayons that were on the table, and then colored like the rest of the kids. The lady that was in charge of my group never confronted me about where I'd been or what I was doing. I guess there were so many kids in that room that she didn't notice I was missing for that short period of time. When the time came for us to go back outside and meet up with our parents, we passed by that room again. Only this time, the lights were on and the room was completely empty. No chair, no Santa. And I was definitely not going to stop to explore the room this time. I'm not sure what my mom or my older siblings did that day, but I didn't bring up my encounter with Santa Claus. For some reason, I just dismissed it and carried on with what I was doing with my group. It was stupid of me not to say anything that day, or when I was traveling home in the car, but I do remember bringing it up at home a few days later. My parents didn't know what the heck I was talking about. They dismissed my story as a dream or a wild imagination. I know I did not make this up, imagine it, or dream it. I didn't bring it up again until a few years later. Again, my parents still didn't know what I was talking about. Then, my mom said something that still disturbs me. She said, if Santa was there that day, I would have been notified about it. The way she said that made so many terrifying things click. Santa was never supposed to be there that day. Even though this happened 25 years ago, these are the details that send chills down my spine to this day. It wasn't December. There were no Christmas decorations. He was in the dark on a day when there were hundreds of kids around, and there was no line to see him. Thinking back on it now, I'll never know who that man was. It's probably for the best that it remains a mystery. When that memory of my encounter with that Santa crosses my mind, I try not to think about what could have happened to me if I had stayed with him another minute longer. I should consider myself lucky that I wasn't abducted that day. That could have been the last day I ever saw my mom and my older siblings. For all you kids out there listening to this story, do not ever encounter anybody that's alone in a room or a public area. It doesn't matter if it's Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or Chipper the Chipmunk. They are still strangers. If they're alone and call for you to come over, run away. Don't take the chance. It's not worth it.
I am a police officer. There was an abandoned building in the mountains of our village, and 4 young men who were on an expedition to the building were recently reported missing. Moreover, I heard from my senior colleague that there had been several more people missing in the building before, but even then, he said no evidence was found. After all, I visited the building to investigate the case. It was an abandoned building that was gloomy, even at a glance. There was a small temple next to it, and I met a monk there. Then I asked the monk about the abandoned building. The monk said that the building was occupied by the devil and told me not to even go near it. I snorted at him because I didn't believe such things, but the monk had a very solemn face, and he said, "Never go inside the building. But if you must go there, remember one thing. If you hear something, you must leave immediately. When the devil opens its mouth, the gates of hell will open as well." I half-heartedly replied okay and went into the building with enthusiasm. I slowly looked around the inside of the dark building with a flashlight when I suddenly saw 2 eyes shining brightly in the dark. When I shined the flashlight, I spotted a man crawling like a snake on the floor. Then he looked at me curiously and whispered something. However, I couldn't hear what he was saying. I pointed my gun at him and shouted, asking who he is. But he kept muttering and ran away, and I followed him. Then, suddenly, my vision was surrounded with total darkness, and I heard his voice, which sounded loud. "My master says he is happy that new food has arrived." As soon as I heard that, I got goosebumps all over my body, and at that moment, I heard the monk's voice in my head. "Get out of that building right now! You are now walking through the entrance to hell, following that snake!" However, it was so dark that I couldn't see ahead. At that time, I heard the monk's sutra in my head, and it became bright again. I felt that I was not inside the building, but in a space surrounded by red veins, and heat radiated from all over the place, making me feel like I was in a pit of fire. And there was a big hole in the floor, and the inside of the hole was like the intestine of a big monster. The intestine kept on wiggling, and a number of hands came out of it that started to grab me and pull me. I fought to death, but the strength of the hands pulling me was so strong that I gradually slipped toward the hole. My body continued to be sucked into the hole as if I was riding a slide, and I called the monk at the top of my lungs as I tried my best not to be sucked in. At that moment, I heard the front door slam open, and I heard the monk's voice. The sound of the monk reciting Buddhist sutras resonated very loudly in the building. Then I heard a scream, and all the hands that had been holding me disappeared. Soon after, the scent of lotus petals began to fill the building, and as the heat dissipated, the large hole in the floor began to shrink. I got out of the hole, and the veins in the hole that had surrounded me finally faded away. At the same time, my whole body felt weak, and I eventually passed out on the spot. When I opened my eyes, I found myself lying in a temple. and the monk was reciting Buddhist scriptures next to me. He told me that it was a close call and told me not to ever do that again. I thanked him for saving my life and said goodbye. Since then, I never went near the building again. And only then did I realize where the missing people had gone.
This is a story about my unforgettable night with a girl I met at a club 3 years ago. Of course, it's not a favorably unforgettable night in a good sense. It was a horrible night. When I first saw her, she looked through the men in the club one by one as if she was shopping for a guy. I avoided contact with her eyes since I didn't have confidence in my face, but she came to talk to me.
I'm curious about your voice.
I was surprised, and I started a messy conversation with her, but she didn't look at my face. She kept looking at my mouth. I talked intently to flirt with her, and she smiled as she listened to what I told her. And we ended up going to her house together. I couldn't believe it all, and I was puzzled. Once she arrived at her house, she suddenly pulled out the rope and picked it up. I popped up much imagination about the item, but didn't want to break the mood by asking her some questions. I tried to settle the mood and carefully approached her for kissing, but she opened my mouth with her hands and told me,
You should talk.
I was much puzzled, but I told her, smiling, the mouth is asking you to talk, right? She then suddenly pulled a small, sharp knife out of the drawer and said,
Yes, I'm also asking you to say something very sweet. Go ahead and try. I'll score the points.
She picked up the knife and looked like she was trying to sting my mouth. My back was sweaty and it was hard to determine whether this situation was serious or just a joke. I said with a smile, Is that right? Let's warm up my mouth for a moment, shall I? I tried to change the mood by playfully moving my mouth. She firmly told me again,
I'm really curious if I caught a delicious fish today. Until now, there have only been the praise with no taste.
I faced her glittering blade and wide-open eyes, and I was finally able to understand what the situation was now. If I make any mistake here, I'll be covered in blood. I was sweating and thinking of this and that like crazy, and then I started talking to her. I never knew such an exhilarating night was waiting for me. It's my first time with a girl like you, the woman who made my heart beat hard like this. Tonight, I'll fill your ears with honey. She closed her eyes and smiled, listening to my voice. And I felt like this was my time, so I slapped her hands and her knife flew all over the room. And I slapped her face with all my strength again. She screamed and fell, and I punched her several times until she was half stunned. Then I quickly ran away from her house. Then I called the police and they investigated her once they arrived. Also, horribly, they heard a swallow faint groan inside her house. After searching all over the house, 3 men were tied up and locked in a room. However, all of them couldn't speak properly and were crying. And it turned out that their tongues were all covered with numerous knife marks. The investigation revealed that she always seduced guys at the club, brought them to her house, and forced them to say something sweet. And she scored their points by drawing their tongues with her knife. When she captured 3 guys, one of the 3 had the disinfectant poured into his mouth and pulled out his tongue because he couldn't hold back his anger, and he cursed at her. The police were shocked by her bizarre behavior and immediately arrested her. However, it is said that she asked the police and even the judge to say something sweet about her. She ended up in jail, but I was so traumatized by the shock after I met that crazy woman. Since then, I could not open my mouth to any woman I met due to the suffering from that experience. Maybe she would search for new guys after getting out of jail. She is just searching for a living toy that can entertain her. If you meet this girl at a club, just run away. Definitely.
My name is Sarah, I'm 21, and I live in a small village in Tamil Nadu, India. This is my story. I live with my mom and my elder brother, who is 24. We recently moved from the city to the village in order to be closer to our relatives. My brother and I were very excited about the move because we both love the village. One day, the 3 of us decided to visit my uncle and his family. His home is located in the middle of the forest area, 20 kilometers from our home. When we arrived, I was so happy to see them all, my uncle, my aunt, and my 10-year-old cousin. We had a wonderful dinner and then relaxed together by watching TV. After a while, I started getting sleepy. Just as I was thinking about whether or not I would head to bed, I got a call on my cell phone. The TV and my family were kind of loud, so I decided to go up to the second floor of the house and answer the phone where it was much quieter. I walked into one of the guest bedrooms as I answered the phone. As I greeted my friend who was calling me, I stepped over to the window and looked out at the view of the forest. That's when I saw an unbelievable scene. I let out an audible gasp as I saw 4 men digging a big hole shaped like a grave. I quickly hid behind the window curtain, phone still to my ear. I told the person on the phone to hold on a moment as I poked my head slowly out from behind the curtain and peered out at the men. They were about 50 meters away from my uncle's house. Next to the grave, I saw a man who was lying on the ground. He was tied up with ropes on his arms and legs, and his mouth was covered with duct tape. He was alive from what I could tell. The window was open, so I could barely hear his muffled screams in the distance. I hung up the call and crouched down so I could get a better view from the bottom of the window. There wasn't just one victim, but 2. There was a woman lying on the ground as well. Just like the man, she was tied up with ropes and duct tape on her mouth. They looked like a couple. Then another man showed up. He was on the bigger side, was probably 5'5" tall, and had shiny black curly hair. He was wearing so much jewelry, bracelets, and chains that there was no doubt in my mind that he was their leader. He came and said something to those men, and they carried both of the people who were tied up and put them in the grave. Then they started filling the hole with dirt. I couldn't take it anymore. My eyes filled with tears, and I immediately ran downstairs to tell my mom what was happening. She called the cops. The cops arrived in time to catch these guys in the act and stopped the couple from being completely buried. Luckily, both of them survived, and all 5 men ended up serving time in prison. I found out later what was happening that day. The girl, that was the daughter of the leader. Apparently, she had fallen in love with someone who was considered lesser than her own family, someone she would never have been allowed to marry because it would have lowered her family's status. The bone-chilling thing that I witnessed was a father attempting to kill his own daughter, a terrifying thing called an honor killing.
Here is some background information. I was in Mississippi visiting my grandma for spring break, just relaxing and having a good time with family. One day, my dad and grandma heard about a restaurant named Clawdaddy's that served crawfish and shrimp. After we got the seafood, we went to a small convenience store. I went inside with my dad while my grandma stayed in the car. When my dad and I walked out, there were police cars and fire trucks everywhere. Me and my dad were confused because we didn't see them when we walked in the store. We got into the car, and my grandma said she saw a woman in a nearby vehicle lying her head on her arms. My grandma thought she had a heart attack. Just before we were about to pull out, a man in his 50s shouted something to my dad, but my dad ignored it. The man came to our window, and what he said still haunts me. He said, "Lock your doors. A woman's boyfriend stabbed her, and she drove all the way here to the convenience store just to get help." Me and my family were shocked. It turns out that woman didn't have a heart attack. Her boyfriend tried to stab her to death. When we were driving back to my grandma's house, a police car rushed behind us. That meant the boyfriend lives in my grandma's neighborhood. My dad and grandma dropped me off and went back out to get food for my dogs while I stayed home alone. Me, just being terrified about the stabbing, I got my grandpa's golf club for security. While having the golf club in my hand, I called my friends to tell them what happened, and all of a sudden, my dogs started barking at something outside. I ran to the door and shouted, "I have a golf club, and I'm not afraid to use it!" But there was no one. When my whole family came home, I felt relieved. We played Phase 10, and I had to stay around them to feel safe. I barely got any sleep that night because I didn't know if the police had caught the boyfriend yet. All I know is I saw police cars and an ambulance heading somewhere. I think the cops killed him, or he is still on the run.
This is the story of a religious trip I took in the Philippines when I was 13 or 14 years old. My friends and I were staying in a 2-story building with lots of rooms in Manila. The view was nice, peaceful, and quiet. On our second day there, my friend Apple and I decided to head to the showers together. The showers in this building weren't in the rooms. They were in a large space where each person had their own cubicle to bathe in. Apple went into the first cubicle, and I went into the second. As we showered, I heard my friend Violet calling for us, asking where we were. I excitedly responded, "Apple's in the first cubicle, and I am in the second one. You can occupy the third one." I was excited that Violet was joining us because at that age, the thought of us taking a bath together was fun. I heard the door next to me open, the shower curtain open, and the shower began to run. As I bathed, I had a conversation with Violet. We talked about typical teenager stuff. As I spoke, Apple called out to me from her stall, "Hey, who are you talking to?" I didn't think much of it. Maybe Apple couldn't hear Violet as well as I could with all the running water. I responded to Apple, "Violet is here. She's in the third cubicle." "Oh, okay," she replied. Now it was Apple, Violet, and I having a conversation. Next, I heard our friend Lila enter the bathroom, calling out to us. I told her where the 3 of us were and encouraged her to use the only remaining shower on the end. Same as with Violet, I heard the door, shower curtain, and water running. We continued to talk with each other for what seemed like a long time. Now, Violet asked if she could borrow my soap since she forgot hers. I said, "Of course." Then I tried to reach the wall above our cubicle since there was a space there. I was handing it to her, but she was not taking it. I said, "Hey Violet, here's your soap." No response. I waited for 5 seconds and no response. I shrugged and figured maybe she'd figured it out and didn't say anything. As I finished cleaning myself up, I called out, "Hey Violet, Lila, we will wait for you so that we can go back to our rooms together." Apple and I sat and waited for the other 2. We could see the cubicle doors from where we were. The doors had this blurred glass, so you can't really see what's inside, but if someone moves around behind the glass, you can see their silhouette. As we sat there, not really talking, I got an odd feeling. That's when I realized that the bathroom we were in was completely silent. No running water sounds, no noise at all. I called out to the other 2. No answer. I looked at Apple, who looked back bewildered. She shrugged. Worried that something might be wrong with my friends, I approached the door of the third cubicle. I lightly pushed on the door, expecting it to be locked, and it wasn't. A pit of fear grew in my stomach. The cubicle, which should be warm from the steam of the running shower, was cold. I closed my eyes and quickly pulled back the shower curtain. "Sorry, Violet." I slowly opened my eyes as I spoke. "I'm just worried about..." I froze on the spot at what I saw, or rather, what I didn't see. The shower was empty and completely dry, like nobody had been there. I rushed out of there and went to the 4th cubicle. Same situation. It was dry, and Lila was nowhere to be found. I was trembling from fear at this point. Who had I been talking to? Did Violet and Lila already leave and I just didn't notice? I reached my shaky hand up to touch the shower head, expecting to feel water. Nothing. It was completely dry. There was no evidence at all that the shower had been used recently. I ran out of the cubicle and grabbed Apple. We ran to our room, and when we arrived, Violet was talking to another friend of ours. We asked her if she was just in the showers, and she insisted she was not. In fact, the people in the room confirmed that she really didn't leave the room. Next, we searched for Lila and found her eating in the cafeteria. We asked her the same question. Just like Violet, she insisted she was there the whole time. Apple and I looked at each other with horrified looks. Who needed the bar of soap? What was I hearing if it wasn't the shower running? And the scariest thought of all, what if someone had been watching me from the next cubicle all that time?
I was conducting a recovery dive in a local lake for the police, recovering the body of some idiotic kid who hadn't worn his life jacket while drinking on a party boat. The lake was deep enough to require mixed gas to avoid narcosis. I followed all the normal protocols, keeping in contact with my diving partner and monitoring my dive computer. It doesn't take long to reach the bottom, but getting back up always takes much longer. My partner and I split up to cover more ground due to the extremely low visibility. It must have been about 5 minutes before I saw it. a human silhouette standing upright at the lake's bottom. I swam closer and found him perfectly preserved, without a sign of decay on his body. He was buried in silt up to his shins. It really looked like it could still be alive or had only been dropped into the water a few moments ago. I tied a line to him and started to head back up toward the surface so I could signal the boat to haul up the body. I swam up, letting the line play out behind me until I reached my first safety stop. While I was waiting for my body to decompress further, I noticed that the spool of the line was still being pulled out even though I had stopped. It was completely taut and unspooling at a blistering speed. It took me about half a second to realize that my reel was about to run out, and I was about to be pulled down by the line. There was a good 900 plus feet on my line, and the speed at which it was being reeled out was so tremendous that as soon as I grabbed it, my hand was split almost completely open to the bone. In retrospect, that was a foolish thing to do, but it was just basic instinct to grab the rope and try to cut it with my knife. I then had a sudden burst of clarity and cut the straps holding the reel to my suit after a few seconds before the line ran out, causing it to vanish into the murky water. Within about half a second, I felt as if though the force of the whiplash alone would have been strong enough to break my back and kill me if I hadn't cut the straps. I was pretty shaken at this point, more shaken than I had been since I'd found my first dead kid. Nevertheless, I managed to ascend slowly and take my safety stops despite the pain, fear, and, of course, all the blood leaking out of my hand. It's a good thing this was a freshwater dive, or I might have been in real trouble on my way up. Anyway, my knee-jerk reaction, and what everyone else told me, was that it was narcosis-fueled hallucinations. Divers see all sorts of crazy things when narcosis kicks in. I've heard stories of fish and squid with human faces. Some guy swears that he was face-to-face with Cthulhu. My point is that narcosis is, to an extent, like temporarily being on DMT, and it can make you see some absolutely insane things. The only thing I could make sense of was how I got the cut on my hand. It's clearly from a rope. It's not clean enough to be from my knife or any other sharp object. The doctor even noticed that I had friction burns all surrounding the cut. So what the heck caused the cut, if I was hallucinating? And if I wasn't hallucinating, what the heck dragged out a line that fast? What really keeps me up at night is that the guy was resting on the bottom of the lake, and my line was going straight down. So either he was pulled through the bottom of the lake, or something with incredible strength and speed grabbed my rope and was reeling me in like a fish. I'm not sure which scenario is worse.
Drawing. It's my favorite hobby, and I love it. It always makes me feel better. Whenever I have a bad day, I just sit down and draw my frustrations out onto paper. I was riding my bike home from school when I suddenly fell off my bike and hit the ground hard. I looked up to see Finn Barker grinning at me. He walked over and picked me up by the front of my shirt with a smirk. "Hey, Zach," he says. I could smell his breath. It smells like rotten fish. "Hi there," I say, forcing a nervous smile on my face. He throws me down. "You almost ran me over with your bike," he exclaims, crossing his arms while looking down at me with a frown. I mutter an apology, but that doesn't seem to satisfy him. He grabs my bike and throws it into the street. A few seconds later, a truck passes by and runs over it. I gasped and stood up, looking at my now ruined bike, as Finn laughed. I ran off to my house, slamming the door shut before locking myself up in my room. I put my head down on my drawing desk. Just then, I looked up to see a pen lying on my desk. It didn't look familiar, but I took it anyway and grabbed a sheet of paper from my backpack. I began drawing a picture of a bike, already missing my old one. The pen was surprisingly smooth, and it didn't seem to smear at all, which was amazing. After a few hours, the door opens and my mom walks in. "Honey, it's 10 at night. Go to sleep. You have school tomorrow," she tells me sternly. "Okay. Mom, did you buy me this pen?" I ask, holding up the pen I had used earlier. She smiled and nodded before exiting my room. I thanked her as she walked out. Then I stood up and flopped onto my bed, quickly falling asleep. I woke up the next morning, already running late. Damn it! I mentally cursed as I jumped out of bed and quickly got ready for school. I ran out of the house once I was ready, but suddenly stopped as I gasped in shock. There was a yellow bike standing on my front porch, and it looked exactly like my old bike. Remembering I'm running late, I just push my shock aside and hop on it, quickly pedaling to school. After a few minutes, I arrived and quickly made my way to class. I entered and slumped on my desk, happy I wasn't tardy. I decided to draw with my new pen to kill time. Suddenly, my friend Jimmy comes up to me. "Dude, guess what I just found out this morning?" he asks me, grinning mischievously. "What?" I ask him curiously. "I found out that Finn is scared of clowns." "Cool, right? We can prank him on Halloween night," he says with a smirk. I looked over at Finn, who was talking with a guy. "So, he's afraid of clowns, huh?" "I have an idea," I say with a smirk as I grab my new pen. I rip a sheet of paper out of my notebook and begin drawing a picture of a clown. "Here, give it to him," I told him. Jimmy nods, taking the drawing of the clown, and he ran off to Finn. He hands him the folded picture of the clown and runs back over to me. I see Finn just shove the paper in his pocket, not even bothering to check what was on it as he continued talking. "There," Jimmy says, smiling innocently. I high-five him and we both laugh. After school, Finn gets to his house, slamming the door behind him. "Hey, Dad, I'm home, old man," he yells as he closes the curtains of the living room window. It was dark outside. Finn curses and walks up to his room, throwing his backpack on the ground. He sits on his bed and turns on the TV, setting the volume very loud. He shoves his hands in his pockets and feels something. He suddenly remembers the sheet of paper Jimmy handed him in class today. He takes the folded paper out of his pocket. "I swear, the kid's gonna die tomorrow if it's a stupid note," he thinks bitterly as he unfolds the paper. His eyes widen in fear as he quickly crumples the paper and throws it across the room. Suddenly, the closet door moves. He turns the volume down and looks at the door. He shakes his head. "It's probably my stupid cat," he mumbles, trying to calm himself down. It happens again, and he stands up and walks over to the closet. "Stupid cat!" He grabs the doorknob and yanks the door open, getting ready to scold his cat. Instead, his eyes widened in fear. Standing there was a clown with tattered clothes and razor-sharp-looking teeth. "Hey, buddy, what's shaking?" the clown asks with a sick smile before cackling out loud like a maniac. Finn backs up and falls on his bed, frozen with fear. "Get away from me!" Finn yells, scared out of his wits. "Oh, come on, kiddo! Want a pie?" the clown asks, holding up a pie that seemed to be the bad type of red. Finn screams, curling up in his bed, as the clown closes in on him. Meanwhile, at Zach's house. "And done, voila!" Zach exclaims to no one in particular as he holds up a sheet of paper, smiling triumphantly. The paper contains a drawing of a creepy clown with tattered clothing and sharp teeth hiding in Finn's closet. The drawing shows Finn curled up on his bed, an expression of pure terror frozen on his face. "Man, I can't wait to see the look on Finn's face tomorrow when he sees this drawing on his desk," Zach says, putting the drawing away in his backpack. If he only knew Finn was no longer going to be a bother at school tomorrow, or for the rest of Zach's life.
About 13 years ago, I went fishing with Patrick and Charles to the river. We were on a small boat and Charles, driving the boat, said, "Do you guys know what's down there? You'd better be careful if you don't want to smell alligator breath." But while fishing, as Charles suddenly drove the boat aggressively, Patrick fell into the water. Patrick was drowning and screaming as he couldn't swim, and Charles quickly drove the boat towards Patrick to save him. But the boat hit Patrick's head. Patrick, who was floundering in the water, stopped moving and disappeared into the water. I shouted at Charles to rescue him. Charles jumped into the water, dived below the surface, and came back out shouting, "Damn, it's too deep!" I was in shock, and Patrick was nowhere to be seen. I kept shouting, and Charles climbed back into the boat, saying, "I think he's already sunk." Charles and I looked around the river, but the water was still. I was in great shock, and there was nothing I could do at that moment. I called the rescue team, and after a while they arrived, but they couldn't easily find Patrick's body because the river was vast and deep. As I returned home, I kept replaying those moments in my head. It was as if Charles had deliberately rammed Patrick. Then did Charles kill Patrick on purpose? Why? We were great buddies. My whole body trembled in shock. Charles told the police everything was an accident, but eventually he was sentenced to 2 years. Thereafter, I made up my mind to sever all ties with Charles. But 2 years later, I got a call from him. "My friend, I'm here! Shall we go crocodile fishing?" That's how we started to meet again from time to time. But whenever he hung out with me, he always went to only uninhabited, remote places and would always say things like this. "Hey, if someone dies here, no one would know, right?" I started to get creepy feelings about him. Once he told me he had something he wanted to do, which was to dig up a deep hole in the mountains, fill it up with water, put 100 piranhas in it, and drown a person in the water. As he talked about it, his eyes lit up like those of a child talking about a toy. Also, while talking about business, he said that if you want to make a lot of money, you have to film a human meat mukbang and post it on the deep web, and he seriously urged me to join him. He seemed to be a psychopath, and I thought that if I continued to hang out with him, I would be in big trouble, and decided not to have any further contact with him. That's how I haven't been in touch with him for about 10 years after that. Then one day, I got a phone call from him saying he got cancer and wanted to see me before he dies. I felt sorry for him for some reason, so I went to the hospital where he was hospitalized. He was lying on the hospital bed, wasted away to a skeleton, and when he saw me, he said, "My friend, we had so much fun in the past. I don't know if you know it or not, but I killed Patrick on purpose. I had missed a really big fish because of him. And just to tell you, I've killed a total of 5 people so far. Do you think the stories I told you in the past were just my imagination?" I'm gonna die soon, but I have one last wish. Won't you grant my last wish before I die? I was so shocked that I couldn't say a word, and he continued to speak in a strained voice. "Sneak a knife from the operation room for me. I want to slit the surgeon's stomach who operated on me, because he opened my stomach. I wonder how the surgeon would react if his stomach is cut open." I left the room without saying anything and ran away. And after a while, I heard that he died in the hospital. I didn't go to his funeral. Would he be resting in peace after he had died? And has he been able to meet Patrick?
I am from South Africa, and these are true stories of strange things that happened to my dad while traveling at night. 25 years ago, when my dad was 20, he and a good friend of his, Chris, were going to a funeral. They left the afternoon before the funeral and expected to arrive the next day early in the morning. It was 1 a.m., and it was Chris's turn to drive. For some reason, he decided to take a shortcut through the forest. It was so dark that they had to take their time as they drove to make sure they didn't miss a turn or hit anything that might be in the road. They came around the corner, and then my dad noticed it. Ahead of them, just at the limit of the headlights, there was a white figure walking toward the road from the forest. Chris slowed the car down, and they both looked cautiously, trying to make out what the figure was as they got closer. It was a South African woman. She was absolutely beautiful and was wearing clean, white, Xhosa bridal attire. As she reached the edge of the road, she put her arm out and made the universal sign hikers use to say they need a ride. My dad and Chris were both confused, wondering why such a beautiful woman was standing on the side of the road in the middle of the forest at 1 a.m. As the car got closer, my dad told Chris not to stop the car and keep on driving. Chris reassured him that he wouldn't be stopping the car. When the woman realized that the car was not stopping, she got closer to the road and leapt at the side of the car. Chris tried to swerve and sped up a bit to prevent her from reaching the car. Just then, they heard a thud on the window of the rear passenger door. My dad quickly looked back to see if maybe she had gotten hurt, but to his surprise, she was nowhere to be seen. She had completely disappeared. My dad and Chris looked at each other. Both were concerned, but weren't really sure what to think of the situation. They continued down the road in silence. That's when they smelled it, the overwhelming putrid smell of a rotting corpse. My dad, having been to a morgue before to identify a family member that had passed away, knew that smell right away. My dad considered rolling down the windows, but because of what they just saw, he decided against it. Instead, he looked over at Chris, who looked back at him with fear in his eyes. My dad signaled Chris to get them out of there, fast. It wasn't long until they were out of the forest, and as soon as they left the tree line, the smell completely disappeared. Originally, they weren't speaking while in the forest because they didn't want to breathe the smell in their mouth. But neither of them dared speak a word until sunrise. My dad knows that woman was a ghost, but never got to know what happened to her, though, or why she was there, haunting that forest. I was 4 years old when this story takes place. My parents and I drove from our home in Johannesburg to the Eastern Cape to visit my grandmother on my mother's side. It usually takes us half a day to get there, so we would often drive through the night. The Eastern Cape is one of the poorest provinces in South Africa, and so most people live in the mountains, in these homes called rondavels. It's mostly farms that you come across as you travel through the area. It's terribly boring as things go. Fortunately, my grandmother did not live on one of these boring farms. She lived near the capital city in a town in the mountains just outside of the capital. The city wasn't massive by any means, and there were a few things to do, but not much. Often you hear about or see people practicing witchcraft, as this was an acceptable religion in the area. My family and I are believers in Christ, so we were grateful to him for keeping us safe whenever we went there. My dad was driving through Queenstown, where witchcraft is very prevalent, and it just happened to be around 3 a.m. as we passed through. My mother and I were asleep. As he drove down the road that led out of town, he noticed a tall, skinny figure ahead of him on his side of the street. This figure was so tall and was far enough away that he couldn't see a face clearly. It was unclear even what gender the being was. The being had a huge afro, and its skin was extremely pale. As the car, a brand new BMW X5, passed this thing, the thing started running alongside the car on his side. My dad was freaked out and decided to drive a bit faster. No matter how fast he drove, the thing kept running next to the car, and there was no way a normal human being could keep up with him as he drove like that. It kept following, so he kept speeding up, going so fast you'd think he was a Formula 1 racer. Still, this thing kept up with the car. Suddenly, the thing slowed down, and my dad, who was still trying to put distance between him and the thing, saw it watching the car from his rearview mirror. My dad fortunately remembered that he was quickly approaching a sharp turn and slowed down in time. This really freaked him out. If he had kept driving as fast as he was around that turn, then we surely would have crashed. That's when he realized that being was after us. It wanted us to have a car accident and die. To this day, my dad believes that thing was a zombie. I was around 6 years old when these two very strange events happened in one night. We were on our way through Eastern Cape. Around 11 p.m., I was asleep in the back seat, and my dad noticed the car was running low on petrol. Luckily, my dad spotted a garage, which is also a gas station, before we ran out. We've done this trip a number of times, but my dad insisted that he'd never seen this garage before. What was even weirder is that it was in the middle of nowhere. Standing outside of this garage was a group of 8 ladies in uniforms. We recognized the uniforms as church uniforms, which is a common attire in some churches in South Africa. Unlike most places, this garage didn't have employees to pump the petrol into the car for you. This struck my dad as odd. He went inside to pay and then came back out to fill the car. As he was filling the car, he glanced in the direction of the church ladies and realized that they had moved closer to our car compared to where they were when we first pulled in. What was weird about that is that he didn't hear any footsteps prior to that. He turned back to the car for a moment, and when he glanced to see if they were still getting closer, he was face to face with one of the church ladies. She stared deep into his eyes with her eyes wide as if she was possessed. She started loudly speaking a language he could not understand, which is very weird because my dad knows every language in South Africa. There are 11 of them. My mother saw what was happening, but she was trembling with fear in the car, uncertain of what to do, and frozen in her seat. The woman started speaking faster. While this was going on, the other ladies were getting closer and closer to the car and were starting to form a circle around the car, but they were completely silent. Suddenly, the woman who was chanting who knows what looked into the car and directly at me. I was still passed out in the back seat. My father describes the way she looked at me as evil. While the lady seemed distracted looking at me, my father quickly finished pouring the petrol and drove off. As we pulled out of the station, my mother looked out the back window and the ladies were gone. My dad is sure that those ladies were witches dressed as church ladies to make themselves look harmless. The second incident happened around 5 a.m. when we were just about an hour away from my grandmother's house. By this time, my dad had been driving all night and was very sleepy. He said that he closed his eyes for 1 second, and the next thing he saw was a sign saying, "Welcome to Jamestown." My father was extremely shocked by this because we had passed Jamestown 3 hours ago. What's even weirder is that we arrived to my grandmother's place 4 hours later, as if our car had somehow teleported back to Jamestown. It was on that day my father decided to change what time we left our home to go to my grandmother's. He was determined to avoid driving through that area at night ever again. This also helped my grandmother, who would call and check on us through the night, more and more frequently the closer we got, and that meant she didn't sleep all night and instead prayed for us while we were on the road. Her phone calls really helped my dad stay awake. Sadly, my grandmother died when I was 9. She'll be terribly missed by the family. As for my dad, I can safely say I think he'd rather forget the strange and terrifying things that happened late at night in the eerie countryside of Eastern Cape.
Hello, Wanzi. I am Freddy from Indonesia, a medical doctor working in a hospital here. I'd like to share some of my personal experiences that continue to perplex me. This incident occurred 5 years ago when I was a medical student during my internship at a hospital. It was a night shift in the pediatric ward department. Patient numbers were low, particularly in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. I recall there being no patients initially, until a new baby arrived. The baby's mother had tragically passed away in the hospital due to postpartum bleeding. The baby was born underweight, only weighing 1,500 grams, and was frail. The father, understandably devastated, wanted to take the baby home against medical advice. However, the doctor prohibited this. This particular pediatrician was known for being stern and even intimidating when teaching interns, but he was always compassionate and friendly towards patients. Around 2 a.m. that night, when both the nurses and I had completed our tasks and were attempting to rest briefly, the pediatrician unexpectedly arrived to visit the baby. This was highly unusual, as he typically visited patients during the morning hours. I presumed he wanted to assess the condition of the newborn patient. When asked about his nocturnal visit, he remained silent. His countenance appeared pallid and unusual. He promptly entered the NICU without explanation. Despite having 5 patients to attend to, he solely focused on the newborn baby. He became visibly distressed upon observing that the nasal oxygen supply for the baby was not positioned correctly. He carefully lifted the baby, embraced it tenderly, and shed a few tears. Following this, he placed the baby back into the incubator and departed without any verbal communication or record entry. This left us baffled, but we resumed our duties and tried to rest once more. At approximately 7 a.m. the following morning, the doctor revisited the NICU and asked me, "Was there a newborn baby patient here in the NICU yesterday? I need to examine a new patient." I responded that he had indeed visited the patient the previous night. To my bewilderment, he appeared confused and denied visiting during the night. He even suggested I might have been dreaming. The nurses and I were left astonished, and to this day, we continue to wonder, if it wasn't the doctor who visited, then who could it have been? I've always lived at the same village for my entire life. It was a nice place for everybody else, but when I was younger, I could always apparently see things that most others couldn't. I still believe in what I saw, since there's no way I could have made those things up, as I wasn't allowed to watch anything scary on the TV because of my parents. My village was actually built on top of a huge graveyard, and a lot of people were killed on the streets and in the houses during the war that happened 30 years ago. I constantly had nightmares and heard voices, but nobody believed me. The scariest experience I ever had has to be the time that I was walking my dog. He was a basset hound and a gentle giant that would never hurt a fly. My house is near a big forest and near a river. I was never scared to go exploring. To get to the forest, we had to go in between tall bushes and down a path that had a cliff next to it. It was the only way in or out. We went further down where the river was, and while my dog walked around, I sat on an old boat that looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but it seemed sturdy. It was a pretty quiet day without any wind when I heard something walking behind me. I turned around just to be greeted by nothing. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably a small animal or something in the tall grass. Sometime later, I heard somebody say my name. Marco. It came from a deep, cracking voice. It didn't sound human. I jerked my head to where I thought I heard it, and I saw a tall, humanoid figure without a head and two glowing red eyes that seemed to be on its chest. I knew I wasn't imagining it because even my dog was barking at it. When I saw it, I turned my head, pretending there was nothing. Usually that was the best working option for me in previous paranormal experiences, but it continued. Marco. Every few seconds, I decided to keep pretending I saw nothing and got my dog to go back up. I started walking with a normal pace so I don't look suspicious, but it didn't stop. Marco. Every few steps, I turned around to look at my dog, secretly looking at where the creature was, and he seemed to continue hugging behind trees, following me. A few minutes later, I could finally see the road, but I was still scared. I started smelling a rotting smell, like rotten eggs and sweat were combined. And all of a sudden, Marco! It screamed my name. Me and my dog started sprinting towards my house. When we finally got there, I shut and locked the door and peeked out of the windows. It stood behind a tree in front of my neighbor's house and just vanished. I was shaken and waited for my parents to tell them what had happened. Of course, they didn't believe me. They never did when I told them these crazy stories. The next day, I went to walk my dog on another path, and staying closer to my house, I saw police in front of my neighbor's house. When I got back home, I asked my parents what happened, and they seemed very shocked. Turns out the neighbor stabbed his wife and fell into the river and drowned. He died right before I went down there. I have a theory that the spirit was his, but I don't know what its intention was. Was it to harm me as well? To tell me to go to his house and see what he did? I've always been puzzled by it, and still am, but at least my parents believe me more when I tell them something paranormal happens.
This is something that happened to me a few years ago when I was living with my family next to a neighbor who had a very old house. Every day I would play with my cousins and little brother in my backyard. We could always see the neighbor watering her plants. She had a pond in her yard where the ducks she owned would joyfully swim. We'd occasionally see her feeding them when she was tending to her yard. One day, her ducks went missing. We tried to help her find them, but weren't able to. There weren't any wild animals in our neighborhood, if you don't count stray cats, but there's no way cats would have eaten these big ducks. Around that same time, my grandma would tell me that there was a girl in a red dress always walking on the roof of my neighbor's house at 3 a.m., but it's only there for an hour. I didn't believe it at first, but my neighbor kept experiencing strange mishaps. One time, while I was playing with my little brother, I heard a scream. I looked over the neighbor's fence to see if everything was okay. When I did, what I saw was horrifying. By the pond, there used to be a pile of regular sticks, but this time, There was a stack of bloody bones and skulls instead. I looked from the pile back to my neighbor, who was standing there frozen. When I looked back at the pile, I could see that there were bugs and insects crawling here and there on the bones. And the smell. There was a putrid smell carried on the soft breeze to my nose. It made me sick to my stomach. Fortunately, my brother was too short to see over the fence. Even though he wanted to see for himself, I did not let him. I didn't want him to be traumatized like me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, the image and smell of the pile of bones still vivid in my mind. I glanced over at the clock after a while. It was 12:59 a.m. Just as the clock switched to 3 a.m., I heard two metal objects banging in my backyard. There was a window in my room, so I got out of bed and walked over to it, trying to see what the noise was. I was horrified to see a girl in a red dress walking on the fence. Her hair was dark and very crazy. Her skin was pale, and from where I was standing, I couldn't see her eyes. Just as I started to wonder how she could walk on the fence like that, I realized that she had two horns coming out of each of her feet. I was frozen in place, unsure what to do. Just then, she let out a horrifying scream and jumped into my backyard, landing on all fours. She twisted her neck and looked directly at the very window I was standing in front of. That's when I saw it. Her eyes weren't there. No eyelids, nothing. Just dark and empty sockets. In an instant, she rushed to my window, and when she got to it, she started banging on the window like she was trying to break it. I fell back away from the window, captured by absolute fear. I screamed, but no one seemed to hear me. She kept scratching and banging at the window, screaming this awful, gut-wrenching scream. I couldn't move, but I could now see, as I stared directly where her eyes should be, that her eye sockets were full of this thick, black liquid, and there were insects crawling in and out of the gross liquid. The entire encounter felt like it took only a few minutes, but when she disappeared, and I no longer felt frozen in place, I looked around and noticed that it was now 4 a.m. I was stuck there in terror for an entire hour. Just like my grandmother said, it disappeared at exactly 4 a.m. At this point, I was shaking so badly that it was almost painful. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. I will never forget that night, especially her face. I will remember that horrifying sight until the day I take my last breath. Human can either be an angel or a devil, and that choice is wholly up to each person. I've dated a devil. I've also realized that it takes only 1 second for a person I thought was an angel to turn into a devil. My ex-boyfriend, Nick, was very sweet. When he drove me home after dating one day, I realized I had left my wallet in his car, so I went back and heard him talking to himself in his car.
Damn it, Nick, be patient. The more you wait, the more thrilling it will be.
He was talking to himself with a knife and a duct tape in his hand. I was surprised to see a new side of him, but I pretended that I didn't hear him and called his name because I thought I would be in big trouble if he picks up on it. Then, in an instant, he hid his knife and looked at me with a friendly facial expression. I was so appalled, and I wanted to break up with him, but first I thought I should gradually disentangle myself from him. A few days later, he called and asked me out on a date, but when I said no, he yelled at me.
You don't want to date me? Then I'll force you to date me.
And from that day on, the nightmare began. One day, he was hiding in front of my house, and when I bumped into him, he came running with a knife, shouting,
Do you want to become prettier? I'll perform plastic surgery on your face.
He swung the knife at me in the face, and I fell down as I tried to avoid it and crawled to the front door. Then he put the knife over my waist and shouted,
Would you like to get liposuction too?
I screamed and ran into the house. Then he pointed at me outside the window and shouted,
Manager, how much is this pig?
He looked at me and kept laughing. When I shouted that I'm going to call the police, he quickly ran away. And after a while, I got a text message from him. The text read, Doesn't it hurt? And a video was attached. When I played it, I found that it was a video of him stabbing a pillow with my picture on it with his knife, recklessly. I shuddered in shock. The next morning, when I looked at my phone, I saw that I've received 100 text messages from him. The text messages read, There's no way you can avoid me except dying. The moment you wake up would rather be in the beginning of a nightmare. If you want to live, come back to me, then I'll wake you up from your nightmare. I vomited and called the police. He seemed to have settled down after being warned by the police, but this wasn't the end. After a while, he sent me a text message saying he was sorry, and he came to my house again. As soon as he saw me, he knelt down, begged, and wept. I felt sorry for him, and when I told him that I'll accept his apology if he goes back home, he shouted, suddenly running towards me.
If this doesn't work, we have no choice but to meet in our next life.
Then he strangled me. I screamed in pain, and he continued.
Please remember me, even when you're reborn, Amanda.
I screamed for help, and he covered my mouth with his hand. Help me!
Shh, my love.
I bit his hand with all my might, and he screamed and removed his hand. Blood flowed from his hands.
Ah! How dare you bite me? Oh, yes. If you want to become a dog, I'll treat you like a dog.
He unfastened his belt and whipped me as if it were a whip. I ran out to the front door and dashed off. He followed me closely, but when he saw the neighbors who came outside after hearing me scream, he ran away. I blocked his number and texted him that I will call the police if he shows up one more time. I haven't heard from him since then, and I don't know what happened to him. I don't even want to think about it again. Perhaps, at this moment, another woman may become his victim. It was exactly 3 a.m. and my dog, who usually sleeps outside, started barking loudly. So loudly it woke me up. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I got up and looked out the window to see what the problem was. He was barking at the gate used to enter our courtyard. I couldn't see what he was barking at from the window, so I decided to go outside and see for myself what he was freaking out about. This gate is joined by a wooden fence. From the door of the house, you can see the road. The moment I opened the door and stood in the doorway, he stopped barking. I looked around and still couldn't see anything because of how dark it was. After a few seconds, and since the dog stopped barking, I headed back to my bed. I lay there for not even 3 minutes and the dog started barking again. Again, I went outside and just like the first time, the barking stopped. And just like before, I looked around from the doorway and saw nothing. I went to bed and the dog would bark again. This whole process happened twice more. The last time, I decided to actually step out of my door and look around. Just like before, the dog started barking, but as I looked around, I saw something moving on the other side of the fence in the corner of my eye. I quickly turned to see a black figure running on all fours like a dog. Only it was definitely not a dog. It was a strange dog-like thing with no hair, completely black from head to toe, and it was running away all creepy, as if it had no bones. I decided to just ignore it as some strange animal of the night, and it probably looked weird to me because I was so tired. I didn't pay too much attention. My dog was still barking at the gate, though. I walked into the yard a bit further to get a better view of the rest of the courtyard. I wanted to see if anyone else was there. There was no one. I started to head back to the house, and just as I did, a wooden stump flew into my yard and landed where I was just standing. I turned to see the stump firmly embedded in the ground. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my dog and I ran inside. I locked the door behind me, went straight to my bed, and hid under the covers. There's no way I was going to sleep. I just sat there, rocking back and forth under the covers until the sun started to shine through the window and I could hear the morning birds chirping. As soon as I heard my mom was up, I went to her and told her what happened. She tried to come up with a logical explanation to put me at ease, but I could tell even she didn't know what could have happened or what that creature might have been. I still shudder at the thought of what would have happened to me if I hadn't turned to go back in the house right at that moment, and that stump had actually hit me in the head. What kind of creature was that? The more I think about it, the more I'm sure that wasn't a dog.
I locked myself in the corner of my room every day and haven't smelled people's breath. But I didn't know that this game addiction would turn me into a hero. That day, I was defeating bosses in the dungeon yet again.
Bow your head before my champions, or I'll crack your skull wide open.
I was playing the game happily for a while, but suddenly I heard my mom yelling from the first floor.
Mom?
I muttered to myself while playing the game.
I clearly told you not to bug me when I'm slaying a dragon.
Then I heard the sound of a window breaking and my mother screaming. I was shocked. It was clear that something had happened. I went to the stairs and looked down on the first floor to see a masked man holding a knife and tying my mom's hands. My blood boiled, but I quietly went back into my room. I never thought I would be using you for something like this. In my room was the Stag Knight's armor. I had spent all my money to custom make it to the highest standards. I put on that armor, grabbed the huge shield and axe, and went down the stairs. As I pounded down the stairs in my heavy armor, the robber looked at me, and I could see his pupils shaking under his mask. I ran over and hit the robber on top of his head with the axe, and he fell down screaming. He trembled as if he was surprised I could do such a thing. Of course, it wasn't a real axe, but it was so heavy and hard that it was a legitimate weapon. He tried to stab me with his knife, but it was useless against my armor. I shouted the name of a skill and hit the top of his head with an axe again, causing him to pass out. I then called the police and they arrested him when they arrived. From then on, my mom loved that I played this game, and I became a hero.
I used to enjoy mountain climbing as a hobby, but now, when I hear the word mountain, I shudder. About 6 years ago, I was hiking as usual and came across a cave. There were bones in the cave. I didn't know whether they were from animals or people, and I was chilled to the bone when I saw them. I walked into the cave to get a closer look at the bones. To my surprise, a strange figure, like a small human, was crouching in the cave. I shouted in surprise, "Gosh, what are you doing here in this dark cave without light?" But it did not move an inch, like a statue. I moved closer. It looked like the back of a very small child sitting crouched. I approached and said to it, "Hey kiddo, this is pretty dangerous." Ow! However, when I looked at its body up close, I realized it was made of thin, wood-like bones. It then turned its head quickly, and I could see several large, insect-like eyes on its face, and dozens of saw-like teeth in its mouth. Then its mouth doubled and unfolded, suddenly spitting out strange liquid toward me. I felt an enormous pain as the liquid got on my face and body. I tried to wipe it off, but it was stuck hard, like glue, and I couldn't make it come off, no matter how hard I tried. I attempted to run away, but it grabbed my thighs with its legs. Its feet felt like scissors, and the tips were sharp like knives. Its feet pressed against my skin with tremendous pressure, and it began to tear my skin. I screamed, ripped its legs off, and ran away desperately. It rushed to chase me, jumping to heights. I ran for quite a long time, and when I finally got out of the cave and turned around, it didn't go out of the cave, it went right back into it. I called the police and explained exactly what I saw, but they didn't believe me. They told me that I had just seen something wrong. I was so angry, but I couldn't help it. I looked at my face and body in the mirror when I got home. My skin was covered with red scars and a thick and clear liquid, and the skin on my thighs was seriously torn with bloody gashes. I called my Uncle Jake, a tough guy who had been hunting for a long time. I told him what I had seen and asked him to capture it. Then he said, "I don't know what that is, but I don't forgive the bastard who dared to spit on my nephew's face. I'll catch it for you. Prepare some barbecue to grill him hot." I met my Uncle Jake a few days later, and we went into the mountains together. I tried to find the cave again, trying to remember the location of the cave where I had seen it. We searched for a long time and finally found the cave. We slowly crept up to the cave and noticed the same thing was just on the inside. It was just sitting there, in the cave, crouching back. It was the same thing that I had seen before. I yelled at Jake, and he slowly approached, pointing a gun at it. Then it suddenly jumped and started spitting the strange liquid at us. Jake clutched his face, screaming in pain, and dropped the gun. It then jumped toward Jake, grabbing his arm, and started biting him. Jake's tremendous screams shook the cave, and I could hear the bones snapped in his arms. When I saw it, my body stiffened with fear, and I couldn't move my legs. Jake's arm was torn wide open and bleeding, with his blood pouring out, and I thought he would die. I ran over, picked up the gun, aimed it precisely, and pulled the trigger, but it pounced on me even after being shot. I shot it again and again. Then it jumped up and down to run away and fell to the ground. I immediately called the police, and they arrived after a while. They were shocked when they saw its body and took it to the station. After that, all I heard from them was that doctors were investigating the mysterious creature's body, and I haven't heard anything since. Jake was transferred to the hospital and had to undergo surgery due to severe damage to the tendons and ligaments in one of his arms. The doctor said he would have died if he hadn't accidentally severed his artery. Jake said it felt like someone cut his flesh with steel scissors when it bit his arm. After that, Jake no longer goes hunting and always tries to avoid talking about the moment we had in the cave, and I could see his whole body shivering every time I brought up the story. This story happened in 2007, as far as I can remember. I was 11 back then, and my family and I went to Sri Lanka for our summer holidays. It was a normal vacation by visiting family there and enjoying the food. We were on a road trip with my uncle, auntie, and my cousin. We planned on visiting the temple, which was located on the southeast coast of Sri Lanka. We prayed, fed the holy cows there, and ate some really good temple food. My dad even cut his hair, as is tradition ritual when you're wishing someone the best of luck. So it was a pretty fun family day, as you say, with no complaints. It was starting to get a little dark, and by dusk, my uncle and my dad decided to look for a motel to stay for the night so we could get some rest before we had to head home the next day. They found a motel nearby the temple, but still out of the city, which was very dry, as far as I can remember, and there was nothing but dry, dusty earth. Behind the building was a wheat field that led to nowhere, but the building was in good condition for its location and age. However, we got 2 rooms on the top floor on the 5th story, one for my family and the other one for my uncle and his family. Our room was pretty small, but enough for 5 people. There was 1 large bed and 1 single bed. Right in front of the large-size bed was a dresser with a TV on it, and next to the large bed was the bathroom with a small window in it. After we got our rooms, I remember we went to the city for dinner and came back to the motel around 10 o'clock. My oldest sister, who was 19 back then, and my brother, who was 9, shared the large bed together, while my parents slept in the bed next to us. We fell asleep and were hoping to sleep through the night because we were all very exhausted from the heat. We knew we had to get up early the next day, so our mom told us that we must get to bed immediately. By about midnight, I can't remember exactly what time it was, but it was very dark. I heard a noise coming from the end of my bed, right in front of the dresser. Because of the moonlight faintly shining in, I could barely make it out. I saw my dad was taking something out of his wallet. I wasn't thinking much of it, but still was wondering why he had to do it at midnight. I fell back asleep and didn't think much of it. A few hours later, I was awoken again, this time by the terrifying noise and scream from my auntie's room next door. I looked to my left and saw that my parents weren't in their bed anymore. While my auntie was screaming and shouting next door, I suddenly saw my mom run back into our room, take off her wedding chain from her neck, and throw it under the bed. Now at this point you should know that a wedding chain is a wedding ring in our culture, which is a holy chain made from a lot of hard work and is extremely valuable. She went back to my auntie's room again, and I looked to my right and saw my brother and sister were also awake. I asked my sister what happened, but she didn't know what was going on and was trying to comfort us. I just know how scared and cold I was. All 3 of us started to tremble and shake with fear. After 5 minutes, my mom came in and gave us a hug. We weren't crying, but we were so incredibly scared, our hearts were beating out of our chests. I'm not sure how it is in the western parts, but we originally lived in Switzerland. However, I noticed that in places like Sri Lanka or anywhere in the southern parts of India, women tend to cry very loudly. As a child, this could be quite distressing. We weren't accustomed to such intense displays of emotion, especially when someone cried out in pain like my aunt did. Her crying made the situation even more unsettling, yet at that time, we didn't fully understand what was happening. After an hour, we fell back asleep because our mom told us to. In the early morning, my parents were awake and were talking about the incident last night. My mom started to tell the horror. By night, a burglar climbed up to my uncle's room on the top floor, right next to our room, and stole a $5,000 wedding chain from my auntie, and also the car key to our van. My uncle woke up because of a noise from the bathroom, investigated, and caught the burglar trying to flee out of the window. When he tried to grab him, the burglar fell out of the window to the ground and disappeared into the wheat field. They chased him through the wheat field, but couldn't find him. The guy escaped, and even the police couldn't find him. Thankfully, we got a second key for our van, packed up everything, and went directly home. Before that, my uncle wanted to make sure that the burglar hadn't left anything behind while running away, in hopes that we might find a clue. However, despite our efforts, we couldn't find anything. My auntie was sad and barely spoke while driving home because she was so traumatized by the incident. While we were driving home, my dad made sure he had everything and looked into his wallet and realized that a small picture of his father was missing, and so was his cash. That's when I realized that the man in front of the dresser wasn't my dad at midnight. It was the burglar himself. I don't want to know what would have happened if that guy realized that I was awake and looking at him. I'm glad it was dark so he couldn't see me, but it also freaks me out when I think about that it actually was the guy who took my auntie's wedding chain and the key of our van. Ever since then, I always make sure that the restroom window and the door to my hotel room is completely locked and deadbolted.